Hello, my name is Lara Gerassi. I'm an assistant professor at the Sandra Rosenbaum School of Social Work, and I use she, her pronouns. We've never presented like this before, so enjoy. Hopefully it won't be too theatrical for you. Go ahead.
I'm Caro. I use they, them, she pronouns, and I'm a PhD candidate in the Sandra Rosenbaum School of Social Work.
And we are thrilled to be talking today about our research study focusing on centering people with lived experiences as social service leaders in sex trafficking, sex trading, and youth organizations, a qualitative community engaged study. Here we go. After all these years, you think I'd be able to use slides. So today we're going to start by sharing a little bit about our acknowledgements and a bit about our social position and the lens that we bring to this work. And then Caro will come in and share about the background for this particular study. And we're really going to focus on, I just realized I didn't start my timer. Would you do that, please? Nope, I can do it. All right. Gonna be theatrical today. So we're going to start by sharing a little bit about sex trading, sex trafficking, and youth services organizations, and why developing and cultivating lived experience expertise in these organizations is so critical. And then focus on capitalism and organizations and exploring the relationships between those two things. Then Caro will also talk about our methods for this particular study, and then I will share a little bit about our results. And I'll present to you this model that emerged about how lived experience experts move into and through leadership roles, and share a little bit of supporting narratives, though in the interest of time, we won't share too many quotes or narratives as we would like. And then we'll conclude with discussion and conclusions, and hopefully have time for questions and discussion. All right, so this study would not be possible without many people. The photo here pictured is Dr. Caro Wages. She started as a PhD student and recently defended her dissertation, which is one of the fun parts of the job, but couldn't be with us today to present. So we're very grateful for her time and expertise on this particular project, as well as, of course, our youth advisory board, study participants, the transcription company, and our funders who allowed this study to be possible. And then this is a little bit about our expertise that we are bringing and our lenses that we're bringing into this work. And I want to share this for two reasons. So one, as the faculty lead of this particular research study, I think it's really critical that we surround ourselves in a variety of different roles in doing this work and doing this work collaboratively with folks who have different perspectives and identities in terms of doing this work. And so while this list is not an exhaustive list of all the things that influence Caro and my sort of approach to this work, I think it's really important to sort of highlight these are the lenses that we're coming from, and the lenses of Sakara or Dr. Wages now, and the youth advisory boards and study participants all hold diverse identities. And I think that was particularly important for this study, and hopefully that will become relevant shortly.
Thank you, Lara. And then moving into the background for our study. So trading sex for compensation is a complex public health problem. Sex trading, sometimes known as the sex trades or sex work, is associated with vulnerability to sexual and physical victimization and an increased risk for sexual risk behaviors, including STIs, substance abuse, as well as mental health disorders. Approximately 5% of young people in the general population and up to 1 in 4 homeless and runaway youth report exchanging sex for some form of financial compensation. And sex trading is known to occur through 3 C's: coercion, such as by another individual, such as a trafficker; circumstance, including to pay for basic needs, known as survival sex; and or by chance, or by choice rather, including for empowerment or pleasure. And to address the health and well-being of people who trade sex across the 3 C's, scholars and survivor activists recommend employing young people with lived experiences as leaders in social service organizations that address youth, homelessness, and or the sex trades. Our understanding of best practices predominantly comes from published memoirs describing individuals' journeys to leadership, as well as organizational toolkits, publications, and presentations. These narratives and resources are incredibly valuable contributions, both in helping others with lived experiences and those of us in the field in understanding and helping to mitigate challenges experienced by those with these lived experiences. However, there's a great need for scientific inquiry that centers the experiences of diverse leaders with these lived experiences. The social service landscape in this field has been known to be color evasive, cisnormative, heteronormative, and ableist in its social service approach. Scientific inquiry that centers with perspectives of diverse people with lived experiences who move to holding positions of power and leadership is crucial. We currently have a limited understanding of how people with lived experiences move into roles as lived experience experts. This is particularly true for lived experience experts from diverse backgrounds and contexts. The type of organizational context and the ways that white supremacy and capitalism show up in the work may impact what avenues lived experience experts pursue and the challenges they encounter along their leadership pathways. While there has been an increase in organizational efforts to be more explicitly anti-white supremacist and to mitigate the harmful effects of capitalism, these challenges are still likely impacting the leadership pathways of those with lived experiences of homelessness, sex trading, and/or sex trafficking, including but not limited to the very real potential for re-exploitation in the name of organizational benefit. One of the ways that capitalism has impacted the ways lived experience experts engage in their work is through the promotion of individualism, including in the nonprofit context. In opposition to a collectivist approach, our current late stage of capitalism promotes the well-being of the business over human well-being, values lived experience for what it can do for an organization without necessarily caring for the person with the lived experiences, centers profits over community building, and doesn't always compensate people adequately for the wisdom and experience they bring to their roles. And this brings us to our current study. The aims of our research were to understand the process by which people with lived experiences of housing instability and/or the sex trade become leaders, including survivor leaders, peer support leaders, and youth advisory board members in related social service organizations, including anti-trafficking, pro-sex work, housing, and youth organizations. Our second aim was to center how these lived experience experts manage systemic level barriers related to their identities, including racism, sexism, classism, and heterosexism, and to uncover the potential conditions that impact the ability to access leadership pathways for people with lived experiences. Moving into the methods of our study, we took a community-engaged approach that used an intersectional, grounded theory approach to the work. We had a community partnership with a youth organization of 6 to 10 young people that we developed relationships with. And the community engagement from these young people ranged from co-developing study questions in our interview guide, providing feedback on the research teams, our team's preliminary interpretation of findings, and giving us directions for next steps. A core component of our methodological approach was to allow participants to drive their experience by choosing one of 3 interviewers with different social positions, experiences of oppression, and access to power. And I will talk about that more in just a few minutes. Study team and community partners co-developed and refined the interview guide as is consistent with our grounded theory approach. And first, the interview guide explored participants' leadership trajectories, including formal and informal leadership roles, and strengths and challenges in their work. We also looked at the roles of social privilege and oppression and how their identities influence their pathways to leadership. And our initially broadly worded questions allowed participants to name for themselves whichever identities or experiences of privilege and oppression appeared salient to them. And we prompted participants for experiences that weren't named. We then explored whether and how these folks were unsupported in their work at their organizations, and finally asked questions about how their work influenced their well-being, including what they gained from their roles and what they lost. Our initial focus on young people was reflective of the literature, as well as our community partners, young people, and helping them support developing leadership skills. Initially, our participants had to be between the ages of 16 and 29 and had to meet 2 criteria: having a lived experience with housing insecurity, homelessness, and/or sex trading for compensation, and hold a leadership position in a related organization, including youth, housing, and sex, anti-trafficking and sex work. Our study used proposive and theoretical sampling approaches. So from that initial criteria of our 16 to 29-year-olds, we expanded our criteria out and engaged in theoretical sampling to include folks up to age 20, or up to age 45 rather. We developed codes and categories for our data And through that, realized that we needed this perspective of older people in these leadership roles to advance our theory. Our potential participants were directed to a screener that assessed inclusion criteria, asked for basic demographic information, and provided verbal and photo descriptions of the research team, which I'll share in a moment. Our research team and the screener for eligibility yielded 11 responses that were determined to be spam participants, and those were excluded. And 44 potential participants were presumed to be real and contacted for a 1-hour Zoom call. 18 of those folks did not respond, so we ended up with our final sample of 26. And participants were emailed a $25 gift card to their choice of Amazon, Target, or Walmart after completion of the interview. And as noted earlier, our team was dedicated to empowering participants in the co-creation of the data and being sensitive to the challenges of speaking about traumas related to systemic oppressions with researchers. Therefore, we offered potential participants the opportunity to choose one of the 3 of us with diverse racial, ethnic, gender, and sexual identities, and professional and lived experiences and backgrounds. This is a screenshot from the survey showing our photos and brief overviews of our positionalities, what we study, and how we approach the work that we do, so that participants could indicate one of us that they would like to be interviewed by, or indicate no preference among the interviewers.
Alrighty. So for our analytic process, all the interviews were transcribed in Deduce, and used a constructivist grounded theory approach. And so this approach really involved, for those of you who may not be familiar, using independent line-by-line coding, accounting for all the details, and then kind of moving into more focused coding to really narrow down some of those themes and analyze some of the conditions under which participants became leaders, the challenges they encountered, and the ways in which they viewed their pathways. And then we engaged in this constant comparison for our developing categories, and particularly with this method, as Caro already mentioned, was focusing on sort of that theoretical sampling. So as it became clear that we needed to hear from folks who had more lived experiences and sort of years under their belt, we then reached out to those folks at that time. And just to note here, member checking is still in progress. Ideally, this would be something that would have been done and completed before we could present. And so hopefully we have a little bit of an update that we can share with you in the Q&A by the time that this recorded session is shared with y'all. All right, so our 26 participants included folks who were between the ages of 22 to 43. About half of our sample were folks of color, 8 identified as mixed or multiracial, 4 identifying as Black African American. 26% of the sample identified as trans and gender expansive, and 62% identified as lesbian, gay, bisexual, pansexual, or queer. And then most folks had experiences of both housing insecurity, or reporting anyway, experiences of both housing insecurity and sex trading. One person had homelessness only, and then there were a couple folks who just reported sex trading only. And we had 12 participants who worked in the sort of anti-sex trafficking, what I'll refer to as kind of mainstream, quote unquote, organizations, with the rest of folks working in homeless youth, et cetera, types of organizations. All right, so let me share a little bit about findings. So in our findings, I'm realizing we did a new setting and that it's messing up my animations. But that's okay. We'll just keep going with it for y'all. So in our findings of our model, we essentially realized that there were 2 contexts that emerged: the individualist context and the collectivist context. The individualist context really could be categorized by folks that were currently still working at a mainstream anti-trafficking or sexual violence organization. And these folks tended to hold more privileged social identities, so identifying with whiteness and as cisgender heterosexual women. And I'll share a breakdown of our demographics by these 2 different contexts in a minute. And then the collectivist context then looks a little bit different. So they tended to work at organizations that were homeless youth, sex worker rights or sex worker organizations, or anti-trafficking organizations, but with a very outward pro-sex work lens that was absent from the individualist context organizations. And these folks tended to hold more minoritized identities, particularly as queer, transgender, and to some extent disabled, which I'll unpack what that means in a minute. So here's sort of the side-by-side demographics of our individualist context and our collectivist context. So while you can see that both of in terms of racial demographics, this was really split 50-50 in terms of having a 50% white in both groups. The representation of folks identifying with whiteness looks a lot more different in the individualist context versus the collectivist context, and with a higher proportion of folks identifying as Black in the collectivist context. And then, as we can see in gender, okay, sorry about that, something went wrong with the slides. So as we can see with the gender, the green represents cisgender women. And so in the individualist movement, it's really, context, it's really striking that there is much more representation of cisgender women compared to trans and gender expansive folks. The reason why we sort of have this caveat around disability is because we did not systematically ask people to disclose disability in their screeners. So we didn't have that demographic information, but there were emerging themes that related to having a disability as a minoritized experience within social services that emerged within the collectivist context that was not, or that was absent in the individualistic context. Not sure why this is doing that. And so then by sexuality, we also see some major differences here as well, right? So, you know, you can see the sort of sample is half heterosexual in the individualist context and really a minority folks in the collectivist context. So I want to present the model. I'm actually going to pause sharing and I will be right back to help deal with the screens. This is not going to work. A little bit. Okay. All right, let me pause the recording, then I will be right back after we deal with this. Okay, technology, always a fun situation, so thank you for your patience. All right, so I want to sort of move to presenting a little bit about our model, and so really thinking about how people with lived experiences move into and maintain leadership roles. So as I mentioned, we had these two different contexts, right? So the individualist context, so folks who were in that more individualist context really got their start by being asked to share their story. And so this really began with sort of being asked or, you know, having some positive experience and some negative experiences around sharing the story of specifically victimization and trafficking and other sort of pieces related to sex trading involvement. And this really varied from collectivists or folks who were in collectivist contexts, because those folks tended to get their start into this work by community organizing and talking much more about how their lived experiences influenced their trajectory into community organizing and then into the work in general. So from there was this cycle of validation and invalidation that occurred. And while there were different layers related to the individualist context and the collectivist context that we'll share in a minute, I do want to highlight that there was similarly this cycle in both contexts. The differences really emerged around pro-sex work advocacy efforts, some experiences related to social minoritization, but folks across these two different contexts talked about inadequate pay and other forms of exploitation of their labor. And so that's a really important point to highlight here. Then from this cycle, there's a difference in how folks kind of moved forward from that validation and invalidation cycle. So for the individual folks in the individualist context, they kind of moved into avoiding some of the key players that were influencing their invalidation. So some of the lack of, mentorship support or things along those lines, then they would sort of move into avoiding that person. And then if that didn't work for a while, then starting a new organization of their own or switching organizations altogether. And, I'll note here that this is part of why it was really salient and rich for us to have the experiences of folks who had more years under their belt of lived experiences. So we could look at this model and towards the right half of it, right? And sort of how people moved from organizations or into different organizations. On the other hand, the collectivists, folks who are in collectivist contexts, attempted much more to repair those existing relationships within the organizations, and often moved to remaining in that particular position, having repaired a particular situation, or switching to a different branch of that particular organization. And I'll also comment that here that when we provided that breakdown between those who are in the collectivist and individualist context, it's important to note that there were some folks who started in an individualist organizations, like a narrative that we'll share at some point, and then kind of shifted into moving into more collectivist organizations. So it is not to say that the fate was sealed of how individuals got their start, but that the organizational context really mattered in terms of their experiences and in terms of how they managed some of the challenges that they experienced. So for folks, beginning with the individualist context, right, there was this period of stabilization often. So folks would talk about taking a period after they exited to particularly their experiences of victimization or exploitation to stabilize, and then being asked to share their story and moving into direct advocacy work. So, for example, this quote from Mary, who identifies as a white heterosexual cisgender woman, who shared about how she really got to where she was on her quote unquote own. So, for example, this quote that reads, "Oh, honestly, I just kind of pulled myself up from my bootstraps," if that makes sense. So, what I want to sort of highlight here is that this is not being shared to diminish the incredible accomplishments that everyone in our sample shared of their leadership and their leadership experience, but it is also to hold at the same time that there are systems of oppression and privilege that matter differently for people, and we know this from lots of different work, and that often within the individualistic context, those systems of privilege that may have helped someone like Mary, who identifies as white and cis and heterosexual, and may not have fully been acknowledged as part of their trajectory. Caro, feel free to jump in if I miss anything. So folks who are in those individualist contexts really talked about the benefits of sharing their story sometimes. So I was just empowered, like how fortunate should I be, should I feel that people are willing to listen to my story, and then also know that hopefully another survivor can read this and believe in something better. So, I think it's really important to highlight that it's the individual, that folks who were in these individualist contexts often were thinking about sort of the collective, right? Here's an example of someone who is in that very individualist context who was sharing their story to benefit somebody else, and yet some of the different contexts really influenced how their sort of trajectory into this work manifested. So this contrasted from the collectivist context, who really started with community organizing and were motivated by and through community. So this was less about being sort of on a sort of speaker to share their particular experience, but more in part of community organizing, sometimes for sex worker rights, sometimes for disability legislation, sometimes for anti-poverty measures, things along those lines. And one of the key differences here is that the collectivist context often talk about, everyone talked about insufficient pay across the board. But for those who were involved in that collectivist context, they often would talk about continuing sex work involvement or other jobs to maintain other sort of sex work or sex trading related jobs in order to continue on their experiences with the leadership development. So as Cal shares, So, the situation you may have is like, okay, well, maybe we can offer you $30,000. Well, if they're doing sex work and they're pulling $60,000, that, you're taking away half their salary. So they can be in a leadership position. So I've had that happen before. So as we mentioned, there was the cycle of validation and invalidation. So the validation was experienced by mentors, supervisors, colleagues, and community members, though the collectivist organizations really talked more about sort of that community validation and community members, much more than the individualist organizations, which really more focused on hierarchical roles, right? Mentors and mentees, for example. And then this sort of contributed to their internal validation as well through self-acceptance and valuing their experiences and their worth. So one of the struggles that both folks in both of these different contexts really experienced was this idea of being handed or offered opportunities, quote unquote, and often without the structural support to actually do the skills that were required for the position. So as Sarah shares, they actually said, we just got this budget approved for this position and we'd love to hand it to you. And there wasn't a lot of structure to help Sarah with some of those pieces. And so, of course, when we think about this, right, who wants to do a job that they feel completely ill-equipped for, right? So just because folks had that lived experience that's informing it, there were all these aspects of the positions that we weren't providing support and structures. And so this varied a bit, but that concept was key and critical across the individualist and the collectivist contexts. So we then have an invalidation sort of at the structural level. So what were the structural supports to help mentor and support growth and leadership development, and also the interpersonal experiences and interactions. So just another example of, and those interpersonal experiences really differed because of the social minoritization piece that was felt more often in the collectivist context than the individualist context. And so, just to sort of bring home this point, Brianna shares, so when being promoted, it was just, they completely supported and believed in me, but that doesn't necessarily mean that as a first-time supervisor manager, I would not need maybe certain trainings on how to be an effective leader and manager. And so this was really influencing that invalidation because of how they would then feel and act in the positions without that sort of structured support and learning. And then it's really important to note one layer that was much more salient for the individualist context was really focused on the re-traumatization and exploitation that came from sharing the story. So as Brittany shares, people would always ask me, like, come to speak at our church or speak at our event. And I'm like, no, I don't do that work anymore. Like, well, why not? You're wasting God's story, you're wasting the story that God gave you. So I want to highlight this quote for a few reasons. Clearly, this is not, best practices in terms of sharing folks, survivor leaders or folks with lived experiences sharing their story, right? It should be on their terms. It should be, at a certain point when, when it's time for them, but they should be the ones deciding and calling the shots, right? And so clearly that's like not part of this narrative here in terms of some of that guilt. And also the religious overtones, of which there are many religious anti-trafficking organizations, some that in my opinion do great work, some that do really awful work. And here is something that is a really important piece of layering sort of this re-traumatization and exploitation within that Christian lens and religious lens more broadly. And so then, sharing again around the collectivist organizations, so like Levi, who was many folks shared really rich examples of different isms that were experienced in the workplace, but Levi certainly shared, and I cannot parse out for you how many of those questions are like, are you really a trans person? And like, what kind of person are you ethnically exactly? And we know that this happens across like a wide variety of literature outside of this particular field, but just to note that it is happening here and it's a problem, particularly for our more minoritized folks who are doing this work. And so the consequences, as we mentioned in the model for the folks in the individualist context were they often ignored or avoided some of the conflicts that emerged, and so then had them unresolved, typically then resulting in them leaving an organization or starting their own. Whereas the collectivist narratives, or folks within that collective organizations currently, some of them started in more of an individualistic context, talked about pushing back and being silenced. So for example, oftentimes these sort of situations lead to leaving folks like myself as a Black woman out of tables and out of spaces and out of that development part of the structure within the organization, is that we too are being forced into silence. And so, of course, folks from these collectivist organizations or contexts were really sort of labeled as difficult, and the impact of community conflict and personal and professional ruptures was really relevant here. And those who were in collectivist organizing and doing pro-sex work advocacy was really having a difficult time finding adequate support and funding. And there's a lot of that attribution to minoritized identities. So as Cal shares, people who are actually doing the work or who maybe don't have the look of what funders are looking for, whether it's primarily, Black and brown led or trans led, or people who are formerly incarcerated led. Whatever that look is that they're looking for, you have people who are actually doing the great work and don't get funded because of their identity. So, what we can't tell is what came first, chicken or an egg, in terms of these pieces, but I think it's really important to highlight here that these issues around systemic oppression, around white supremacy, around capitalism that Caro sort of touched on in the beginning, really emerged extremely saliently in our model. And that these experiences are layered based on sort of context, but also based on the sort of minoritized in particular identities that folks had, and more relevantly, the systems of oppression that folks encountered. So I'd like to talk a little bit about some strengths and limitations of the study before we discuss and conclude, and then hopefully have time for questions. So I think a strength of this approach was study was a community engaged approach. I think a strength and challenge of it was that we had a heterogeneity of participant experiences. And so, that was made for very rich data, but we also could have kept going and going in terms of having more and more perspectives beyond the scope of what the study could do and was funded to do. We did not capture those beyond the scope of the study, those who with lived experience or lived experience experts who have left the field entirely to do something else. We know they are out there. Maybe they're in this room and sort of interested in this conference in some way, or doing some work in some other way, or not out. But that's a really important gap that I think we need to understand better. There is, of course, potential for recall bias, particularly for folks who were quote unquote older or had more lived experience under their belt. And we would have loved to do follow-up interviews. There were some changes to our advisory board that made some challenges. And like I mentioned, member checking is still in process. And so I think these results will be more possibly richer as a result of that member checking. So lived experience experts are critical to social services, but our systems are just not built for them to thrive. This isn't to say that individual lived experience experts don't thrive, because they do. There are probably many in this virtual room who are doing that, right? And doing that every day. But it is to say that the systems that are influenced by white supremacy and capitalism are not built to help people thrive, and particularly to help folks with minoritized identities thrive. So our major gaps: insufficient funding structures and sort of supportive levels, mentorship supports, leadership development and practices and policies to support experts. So these are things that should be structured and explicit. And, as Caro mentioned in the beginning, there are resources out there from National Survivor Network and from various toolkits, lots of different organizations that are doing some of this work to help fill these gaps. But this should be a given in terms of the organizations that are hiring and sort of facilitating some of these lived experience experts to have these leadership roles. And it's possible, we don't know this for sure from the study, but it's possible that the lived experience experts, particularly those with multiply minoritized identities, may transition to other roles or out of the advocacy movement. We need to structure these supports better so that lived experience can thrive. This is on organizations in the social service field and researchers. I'm in the same boat as a researcher now and sort of employing folks with lived experiences, same thing. And really thinking about, best practices around survivors who do choose to tell their story. For some, it can be empowering, but it is their choice as to when to and when not to tell their story. We definitely need to sort of think about trainings and supports for these different tasks, particularly if someone is moving from, say, a peer support group facilitator to a program manager, really some of that structured pieces to help them thrive and gain the skills that they need. And so all of this really reinforces this idea of anti-capitalist and anti-white supremacist organizational approaches, and the importance of compensation and funding to recognize the labor. I think in terms of future research, we need to really examine the perspectives of those who have left the field. They're hard to find, are harder to find, but I think this is a really important piece. And to understand pay scales, so what are people making concretely in sort of among lived experience experts for what type of jobs, right? Really understanding that and doing more of a analysis of that. And developing interventions to support both lived experience experts, and there are certainly folks that are doing some of this on the ground in grassroots efforts, and also for organizations to help support some of this work. Thank you for dealing with our technological issues and our gratitude. Our contact information is here. Caro will not be here the day of the live presentation, but I'm looking forward to taking your questions. And in the PDF of the slides, I'll include some references that are at the end here for your benefit. Thank you so much.